Hello everyone and welcome back to a new scary story. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe and like the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Tonight, we're diving deep into Oregon's darkest secrets, the kind of stories people whisper about but rarely dare to share out loud. These aren't campfire tales or internet rumors. They're real experiences from people who came face to face with things they can't explain. From shadowy figures in the woods to encounters that left survivors questioning their own sanity. Each of these 6 accounts pulls us deeper into the unknown. So turn down the lights, lock your doors, and stay with me until the very end. Because once you hear what happened out here in the Pacific Northwest, you'll think twice before ever wandering those lonely roads or forests alone. Before we begin the story, hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next buried truth. Let us know in the comments below which Oregon location you would never visit alone after hearing these stories. After 15 years in the Oregon Forest Service, I believed I had seen every challenge these woods could present. I was mistaken. What occurred last October in the Deschutes National Forest brought my career to a close. My name is Joshua, and I used to patrol the remote areas where few people ever ventured. My duty was to inspect trail conditions, check for unlawful campsites, and guarantee the safety of hikers in some of Oregon's most secluded wilderness. I loved that job more than anything, which makes what I am about to tell you all the more difficult to accept. The incident took place during what should have been a standard inspection of the Three Sisters Wilderness area. I had been assigned to survey a part of the trail that had been closed to the public for 3 months due to a reported landslide. The area was about 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only on foot through a dense forest of pine and fir that stretched for miles in every direction. I had walked this particular segment dozens of times over the years, and I knew every landmark, every stream crossing, and every possible danger along the way. That morning began like any other. I filled my backpack with my usual supplies, including emergency gear, radio equipment, and my service sidearm. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a long day hike into the wilderness. I checked out at the ranger station at 6:30 in the morning and began the trek to the closed trail section. The initial hours passed without incident as I moved along familiar paths, logging trail conditions and taking pictures of areas that would require maintenance. The trouble began around 11 in the morning when I reached the section that had supposedly suffered landslide damage. According to the incident report filed 3 months prior, a huge rock slide had completely blocked the trail, making it impassable for hikers. However, when I arrived at the coordinates listed in the report, I found the trail completely clear. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris, no damaged trees, nothing to suggest that any kind of geological event had happened in the area. The trail looked exactly as it had during my last patrol 6 months earlier. I spent nearly an hour surveying the area, taking pictures and measurements to record what I was seeing. According to my GPS unit, I was definitely in the correct location. The coordinates matched perfectly with those in the incident report, but there was absolutely no sign of the landslide that had supposedly closed this part of the trail. I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings, but I could not get through. The radio crackled with static, which was unusual since I had tested the equipment that morning and confirmed it was working correctly. I decided to continue along the trail to see if perhaps the landslide had occurred further ahead than originally reported. The path meandered through an increasingly dense forest, with towering Douglas firs creating a thick canopy overhead. The undergrowth was heavy with ferns and moss, and the air carried that distinct scent of decaying pine needles and damp earth that you only find deep in old-growth forests. Everything seemed normal and peaceful until I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The forest had become completely silent. No birds chirped, no small animals rustled in the undergrowth, and no insects buzzed. The only sounds were my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. In 15 years of working in these woods, I had never experienced such a complete and unnatural silence. Every instinct I had developed during my career was telling me that something was very wrong. I stood still for several minutes, listening carefully for any sound that might explain the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. That was when I first heard it, a low humming sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. It was barely audible at first, more of a vibration I felt in my chest than an actual sound. But as I stood there listening, it gradually grew louder and more distinct. The humming had an almost mechanical quality, like the sound of distant machinery or electrical equipment. However, there were no power lines in this area, no buildings and no roads, nothing that could produce such a sound. I took out my GPS unit to confirm my location and verify that I had not somehow strayed off course. The display showed that I was still following the designated trail, miles from any human development. I decided to investigate the source of the humming, moving cautiously along the trail with all my senses on high alert. The sound grew gradually louder as I advanced, and I began to notice other unusual signs. The trees along the trail appeared to be dying, their needles brown and brittle despite it being early autumn. The undergrowth was sparse and sickly looking, as if something had drained all the life from the forest floor. After walking for another 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing that I had never seen before, despite hiking this trail countless times. The clearing was a perfect circle, about 50 feet in diameter and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard like concrete with strange geometric patterns etched into the surface. The humming sound was much louder here, and I could feel it resonating through the soles of my boots. At the center of the clearing stood what I can only describe as a structure. Though it defied any conventional architectural description, it seemed to be made of a dark metallic material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The structure was roughly cylindrical, about 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, with no visible seams, joints, or openings. The surface was covered with the same geometric patterns etched into the ground, and the entire thing seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. I approached the structure cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around and leave immediately. But my training and professional curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I needed to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that could be analyzed and explained by people with more expertise than I had. I pulled out my camera and began taking photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the structure and the strange patterns carved into the clearing floor. As I moved around the structure taking pictures, I noticed that my compass was spinning wildly, unable to settle on a consistent direction. My GPS unit had stopped working entirely, displaying only error messages when I tried to determine my location. Even more unsettling, my watch had stopped, its hands frozen at exactly 11:47, though I was certain it had been working correctly when I checked it earlier. The humming sound began to change, becoming more complex and varied, almost like an alien language or communication system. I could feel the vibrations growing stronger, penetrating deep into my body and making my bones ache. The air around the structure began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement, though the temperature felt normal. That was when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in my peripheral vision. But as I focused on them, the shadows became more distinct and solid. They were humanoid in shape but wrong in every detail, too tall, too thin, with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were featureless and dark like voids in the shape of human heads. There were 3 of them that I could see clearly, though I had the sense that more were present just beyond the tree line. They moved with purpose, circling the clearing in a pattern that seemed to mirror the geometric designs carved into the ground. They paid no attention to me at first, as if I were invisible or irrelevant to whatever they were doing. I continued taking photographs, though my hands were shaking so badly that I was not sure any of the images would be usable. A part of me wanted to flee, to get as far away from that clearing as possible, but another part, the professional part that had served me well throughout my career, insisted that I needed to document everything I was witnessing. This was beyond anything in my training or experience, but it was real, and it was happening in a forest that was under my protection. One of the shadow figures suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. Even though it had no visible eyes or facial features, I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. The humming sound changed again, becoming sharper and more urgent, almost threatening in its tone. The other figures stopped their circling and also turned toward me. I felt a wave of something. Not heat or cold, but some other form of energy that made every nerve in my body scream in alarm. My camera stopped working. the display going dark despite a full battery. My radio, which had been producing only static, went completely dead. Even the digital display on my GPS unit flickered and went blank. I knew I had to leave immediately. Every survival instinct I possessed was telling me that I was in grave danger. I backed slowly toward the tree line, never taking my eyes off the shadow figures. They did not follow me, but I could feel their attention tracking my every movement. The humming sound grew louder and more aggressive, as if warning me never to return. Once I reached the safety of the forest, I turned and ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs in my desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing. I did not stop running until I reached my vehicle, and even then, I could still feel the phantom vibrations of that alien humming in my bones. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. How could I possibly report what I had witnessed? Who would believe such an impossible story? But I had to try. I had a professional and moral obligation to document the incident and ensure that other people did not stumble into whatever was lurking in that clearing. When I arrived at the station, I immediately went to my supervisor and requested a private meeting. I told him everything, describing the clearing, the structure, and the shadow figures in as much detail as I could remember. He listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as my story progressed. When I finished my account, he asked to see the photographs I had taken. I handed over my camera, but when we reviewed the images, they showed nothing but normal forest scenes. The clearing was not visible in any of the pictures, nor was the strange structure or the shadow figures. According to the camera, I had spent the day hiking through a perfectly ordinary woodland. My supervisor suggested that I might be suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration, both of which could cause hallucinations and disorientation. He recommended that I take a few days off to rest and recover, and then we would discuss the incident further. But I knew what I had seen was real despite the lack of photographic evidence. Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that maybe my supervisor was right. Maybe I had experienced some kind of medical episode that caused me to hallucinate the entire incident. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The memory of that clearing was too vivid, too detailed, and too consistent to be dismissed as a hallucination. I requested permission to return to the area with a partner, but my supervisor denied the request. He cited safety concerns and suggested that I focus on less remote assignments until I had fully recovered from whatever had affected me during the patrol. But I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. The final straw came 3 weeks later, when I tried to access the incident report that had originally sent me to investigate the landslide. According to the filing system, no such report existed. There was no record of any landslide in that area, no closure order for the trail, and no assignment for me to investigate. According to the official records, I had never been sent to that section of the Deschutes National Forest. When I confronted my supervisor about the missing paperwork, he became defensive and suggested that I might be confusing details from different assignments. He implied that my mental state was deteriorating and that perhaps it was time for me to consider early retirement. The message was clear: stop pursuing this matter or face the consequences. I realized that whatever was happening in that clearing was being covered up at levels far above my pay grade. Someone or something did not want that area investigated or documented. My choice was simple: stay quiet and keep my job, or continue asking questions and face termination. I chose to resign. I could not continue working for an organization that would conceal something so significant from the public. People had a right to know about the dangers lurking in our national forest, even if those dangers defied conventional explanation. That was 6 months ago. I have not returned to the Deschutes National Forest since then, and I have no intention of ever going back. But sometimes late at night, when the wind blows through the trees outside my house, I swear I can still hear that alien humming sound calling to me from the depths of the Oregon wilderness. I know most people will not believe my story, just as my former supervisor did not believe it. But I also know that what I experienced in that clearing was real, regardless of what the official records might say. There are things in our forest that we do not understand, things that someone in authority has decided we are better off not knowing about. All I can do now is warn others to be careful when venturing into remote wilderness areas. Stay on marked trails, Travel with partners and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. The forest may look peaceful and welcoming, but there are places where the normal rules of reality do not apply, and those places are far more dangerous than any wild animal you might encounter. If you ever find yourself in a clearing where no birds sing and no insects buzz, where strange structures rise from geometric patterns carved into lifeless earth, do not investigate. Do not take photographs. Do not try to understand what you are seeing. Just run and never look back. I have been participating in Oregon Trail reenactments for 8 years, always striving to make the experience as authentic as possible. But during our 2024 journey near Baker City, we discovered that some parts of history should never be relived. My name is Olivia, and what I'm about to tell you is why I will never participate in another historical reenactment for as long as I live. For those unfamiliar with what Oregon Trail reenactments entail, we are a group of history enthusiasts who spend weeks each summer recreating the journey that pioneers made across the American West in the 1800s. We use authentic equipment, wear period attire, and follow the same routes that thousands of families traveled over 150 years ago. The goal is to gain a deeper understanding of the hardships and challenges faced by those brave individuals who helped build this country. Our group consisted of 12 adults and 6 children, ranging in age from 8 to 62. We had been planning this particular reenactment for 2 years, working with historians and local authorities to map out an authentic route through eastern Oregon that would take us along some of the lesser-known segments of the original Oregon Trail. The journey was scheduled to last 3 weeks, covering approximately 180 miles of challenging terrain. I had been chosen as the wagon master for this expedition, which meant I was responsible for coordinating our daily movements, ensuring everyone stayed safe and maintaining the historical accuracy of our experience. I took this role very seriously, spending months researching the specific challenges faced by pioneer families in this region during the 1840s and 1850s. Our preparation was extensive. We had authentic covered wagons pulled by oxen, period-appropriate clothing and tools, and historically accurate food supplies, including hardtack, dried beans, and salted meat. We carried no modern conveniences except for emergency communication equipment and basic medical supplies, both of which were kept hidden from view to maintain the illusion of authenticity. The first week of our journey went exactly as planned. The weather was favorable, our oxen were strong and healthy, and the group was in high spirits. We followed wagon ruts that were still visible after more than a century, camping each night in locations that had been used by actual pioneer families during their westward migration. The children in our group were especially excited, treating the entire experience like the ultimate educational adventure. But everything changed during our second week when we reached a section of the trail near Baker City that none of us had ever traveled before. According to our historical maps, this area had been the site of several tragic incidents during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. Families had been forced to abandon wagons and possessions when the terrain became too difficult to navigate. Some had died from disease, others from accidents, and a few had simply disappeared without explanation. The landscape in this region was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain, steep hills, and very little water. The original pioneers had struggled greatly to cross this section, and we were beginning to understand why. Our oxen were having difficulty pulling the wagons over the rough ground, and we were forced to stop frequently to rest both the animals and ourselves. It was during one of these rest stops that we first noticed something unusual. While examining the ground around our campsite, one of our group members discovered what appeared to be remnants of an old wagon wheel, partially buried in the dirt and rocks. This was not uncommon along the Oregon Trail, as pioneers were often forced to abandon equipment that became too damaged or burdensome to continue carrying. But as we examined the wheel more closely, we realized it was in remarkably good condition for something that should have been over 150 years old. The wood showed signs of age and weathering, but it had not rotted or disintegrated as we would have expected. More disturbing, there were dark stains on the wood that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Our group historian, a retired professor named Margaret, suggested that we might have discovered an artifact from one of the documented tragedies that had occurred in this area. She pulled out her research materials and confirmed that at least 3 separate wagon trains had reported serious incidents at this location, including accidents, illness, and attacks by hostile parties. That night, as we sat around our campfire eating our simple meal of beans and hardtack, Margaret shared some of the historical accounts she had uncovered during her research. The stories were darker than any of us had expected, involving not just the typical hardships of frontier life but also violence, betrayal, and mysterious disappearances that had never been properly explained. One account from 1847 described a family of 7 who had stopped to rest in this exact area after their wagon broke down. When a search party found them 3 days later, the parents and oldest children were missing and the 2 youngest children were found hiding in the wagon, too traumatized to speak. The children eventually told authorities that strange people had come in the night, people who looked like pioneers but acted wrong, moving and talking in ways that frightened them. Another story from 1852 involved a wagon train of 23 families who camped in this region for 2 nights while making repairs to their equipment. On the second night, several members of the group reported hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, voices that sounded like family members who were supposed to be sleeping in their wagons. When they investigated, they found their actual family members safe in their beds with no explanation for the voices they had heard. The most disturbing account came from 1856, when a group of 15 pioneers reported encountering what they described as a phantom wagon train. According to their testimony, they had seen another group of travelers moving parallel to their route, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When they tried to make contact with these other pioneers, hoping to join forces for mutual protection, the phantom group would vanish entirely, only to reappear in a different location hours later. As Margaret shared these historical accounts, I noticed that several members of our group were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The children especially seemed frightened by the stories, and I began to worry that our pursuit of historical authenticity might be having a negative impact on what was supposed to be an educational and enjoyable experience. But it was too late to change course. We were committed to following the historical route, and we were already 2 weeks into our journey with only 1 week remaining. We had invested too much time, money, and effort to abandon the expedition based on old stories and legends that probably had perfectly rational explanations. That night, I lay in my bedroll, listening to the sounds of the wilderness around us, the wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of coyotes, and the occasional snort or shifting movement of our oxen as they grazed nearby. But mixed in with these natural sounds, I began to hear something else. Voices, very faint and distant, that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond our campsite. At first, I assumed it was other members of our group talking quietly around the dying embers of our campfire. But when I raised my head to look, I could see that everyone in our camp was asleep. The voices were coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by our fire. I listened carefully, trying to determine what the voices were saying and where exactly they were coming from. They seemed to be having a conversation, multiple people discussing something in urgent, hushed tones, but I could not make out the specific words, and the sound seemed to move around our campsite, coming first from one direction and then from another. I considered waking the others, but I did not want to cause unnecessary alarm over what might simply be travelers camped somewhere nearby. Instead, I lay quietly and continued to listen, hoping the voices would either stop or become clear enough for me to understand what was being said. After nearly an hour of listening to the mysterious conversation, I finally heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices clearly called out the name of Margaret, our group historian. Not shouting her name as if trying to get her attention, but discussing her in the same hushed tone that had characterized the entire conversation. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. Someone was out there in the darkness talking about one of our group members by name. This was no coincidence, and it was certainly not a group of innocent travelers who happened to be camping nearby. I quietly made my way over to where Margaret was sleeping and gently shook her awake. When she opened her eyes, I put my finger to my lips and pointed toward the darkness where the voices were coming from. She sat up slowly, listening carefully, and after a few minutes she heard them too. We woke the other adults in our group one by one, being careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Soon, we had 8 adults sitting quietly around the remains of our campfire, all listening to the mysterious voices that continued to drift through the darkness around us. The conversation seemed to be focused on our group specifically, discussing our movements, our equipment, and individual members by name. They knew details about our journey that no outsider should have known. including our planned route for the following day and the specific supplies we were carrying in our wagons. One of the men in our group, a retired military officer named Robert, suggested that we might be dealing with modern-day thieves who had been monitoring our expedition and were planning to rob us of our authentic historical equipment and supplies. Some of our wagons, oxen, and period artifacts were worth considerable money, and we were carrying everything in isolated wilderness areas where criminal activity would be difficult to detect or investigate. But as we continued to listen to the voices, it became clear that this was not a simple robbery scheme. The people talking about us were discussing our journey in ways that suggested they knew far more about the historical Oregon Trail than any ordinary criminals would know. They referenced specific events from the 1800s, mentioned families and individuals who had traveled this route over 150 years ago, and spoke about our reenactment as if it were somehow connected to those long-ago tragedies. Margaret grabbed her research materials and began looking through her historical accounts, comparing what the voices were saying to the documented incidents she had uncovered. The correlation was undeniable. The voices were referencing the same families, the same tragedies, and the same mysterious disappearances that had been reported in this area during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. As dawn began to break, the voices gradually faded away, leaving us exhausted and deeply unsettled. We had spent the entire night listening to people discuss our expedition in detail, but we had never seen who was talking or determined where they were located. Despite searching the area around our campsite, we found no evidence that anyone else had been nearby during the night. We faced a difficult decision. We could continue with our planned route, hoping that the previous night had been an isolated incident, or we could abandon our carefully planned expedition and head for the nearest town. The rational part of me wanted to continue to maintain the historical authenticity of our journey and complete what we had started, but the protective part of me was deeply concerned about the safety of the children in our group. The decision was made for us later that morning when we discovered that one of our wagons had been damaged during the night. The canvas top had been slashed in multiple places, and several of our essential supplies had been stolen, including most of our remaining food and all of our medical supplies. Whoever had been talking about us in the darkness had also taken action against us. Robert conducted a thorough investigation of the crime scene, using his military training to look for clues about who might have been responsible for the theft and vandalism. What he found was more disturbing than the crime itself. The footprints around our damaged wagon were not from modern hiking boots or work shoes, but from what appeared to be authentic period footwear, the kind of leather boots and shoes that pioneers would have worn during the 1800s. More unsettling, the method used to slash our wagon canvas was not consistent with a modern knife or blade, but rather with the kind of rough, improvised cutting tools that would have been available to travelers on the original Oregon Trail. We had no choice but to abandon our expedition. With our food supplies stolen and our wagon damaged, we could not safely continue our journey, especially with children in our group. We loaded our remaining supplies into the undamaged wagons and began the difficult trek back toward the nearest town, where we could get help and contact authorities about the theft. The return journey was tense and frightening. We moved as quickly as possible while constantly watching for signs that we were being followed or observed. Several times during that first day, members of our group reported seeing figures in the distance, people dressed in period clothing, who seemed to be shadowing our movements but always staying just far, enough away to avoid clear identification. Our final night before reaching town, we experienced the most terrifying incident of the entire expedition. As we set up camp in what we hoped would be a safe location near a well-traveled road, we began to hear the voices again. But this time they were not discussing our movements from a distance. They were calling to us directly, trying to convince members of our group to leave the safety of our campsite and come into the darkness. The voices claimed to be other reenactors who had become separated from their own group and needed our help. They knew the names of several people in our expedition and referenced specific details about our journey that made their claims seem plausible. But Robert and I recognized the voices from the night before, and we knew that this was some kind of trap or trick designed to lure us away from our group. The most chilling moment came when one of the voices called out to Margaret specifically, claiming to be her research partner from the university, and insisting that he had discovered evidence of an important historical artifact nearby. The voice knew details about Margaret's academic work that no stranger should have known, and for a moment, even she seemed tempted to investigate. We managed to keep everyone together until morning, but it required constant vigilance and repeated reminders that nothing good could come from venturing into the darkness to meet mysterious strangers who claimed to need our help. The children were especially frightened by the voices calling to them, and several of the adults admitted later that they had felt an almost irresistible urge to respond to the calls. When we finally reached town the next day, we immediately contacted local law enforcement to report the theft and harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The sheriff listened to our account with a mixture of skepticism and concern, clearly having difficulty believing that we had been systematically stalked and robbed by people dressed as 1800s pioneers. But when we mentioned the specific location where the incidents had occurred, his expression changed dramatically. He explained that our group was not the first to report strange encounters in that particular area. Over the years, several other historical reenactment groups, hiking parties, and even some local residents had described similar experiences involving mysterious figures in period clothing, who seemed to know far more about visitors than they should. The sheriff suggested that we might be dealing with a group of individuals who had become obsessed with Oregon Trail history, to the point where they were living out some kind of elaborate fantasy in the wilderness. These people might be using their extensive historical knowledge to intimidate and rob visitors while maintaining the illusion that they were somehow connected to the original pioneer experience, but he also mentioned a darker possibility that had been discussed among local law enforcement. There had been several unexplained disappearances in the region over the years involving people who had last been seen hiking or camping in areas associated with Oregon Trail history. While there was no concrete evidence connecting these disappearances to the mysterious figures that visitors kept reporting, the correlation was troubling enough to warrant serious concern. We never recovered our stolen supplies or received any explanation for the harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The case remained open but inactive, with local authorities occasionally following up on similar reports but never making any arrests or gathering definitive evidence about who was responsible for the ongoing incidents. Disbanded our reenactment group after that experience, and I have never participated in another Oregon Trail expedition. Several other members of our group reported having nightmares for months afterward, dreams involving the voices calling to them from the darkness and mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know intimate details about their personal lives. Margaret continued her historical research for a while, but she eventually abandoned her Oregon Trail project as well. She told me later that she could no longer read accounts of pioneer tragedies without hearing those voices from the wilderness, and that the entire subject had become too psychologically disturbing for her to continue studying. The children in our group were perhaps affected most severely by the experience. Several of them developed anxiety about camping or spending time outdoors, and their parents reported that they would wake up in the middle of the night claiming to hear voices calling their names from outside their bedrooms. I still believe that historical reenactments can be valuable, educational experiences when conducted safely and appropriately. But I also know that there are some places and some periods of history that should be left undisturbed. The Oregon Trail represents one of the most challenging and tragic chapters in American pioneer history, involving thousands of deaths, countless hardships, and mysteries that have never been solved. Perhaps some of those mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the voices we heard in the darkness were echoes of tragedies that occurred more than 150 years ago, still playing out in places where the boundary between past and present has become dangerously thin. Or perhaps we encountered something far more concrete and threatening, a group of people who have become so obsessed with recreating the past that they have lost touch with the present. Either way, I learned that there are limits to how authentic a historical experience should be, and that some parts of history are too dangerous to relive. The Oregon Trail claimed thousands of lives during the years of westward migration, and it may still be claiming lives today. I urge anyone interested in Oregon Trail history to study it from the safety of libraries and museums, rather than venturing into the wilderness areas where those original tragedies occurred. Some experiences are meant to remain in the past, and some voices are meant to remain silent. The lessons of history are important, but they should never come at the cost of modern lives and safety. The trail west was difficult enough for the original pioneers who had no choice but to travel it. Those of us who do have a choice should choose wisely. Working maintenance at Crater Lake during the off-season means months of complete solitude. It is just you, the snow, and that impossibly deep water. But in February 2023, I realized I was not as alone as I thought. My name is Christopher, and for 12 years, I have been part of the park maintenance crew that keeps Crater Lake National Park operational when the tourists are gone and the roads are buried under 15 feet of snow. Most people do not realize what it takes to maintain a place like Crater Lake through the winter months. We are talking about one of the most remote locations in Oregon, accessible only by snowcat or skis for nearly 6 months of the year. The park officially closes to vehicle traffic in November, and we do not see regular visitors again until late May or June. During those winter months, only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers, rangers, and emergency personnel remain on site. I have always loved the isolation that comes with winter work at Crater Lake. There is something peaceful about being surrounded by pristine wilderness with nothing but the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake's surface. The work is hard physical labor in brutal conditions, but it has always been worth it for the solitude and the connection to one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Our crew of 4 was responsible for maintaining the visitor center, the lodge facilities, and the critical infrastructure that keeps the park operational during the winter closure. We lived in staff quarters at the rim, isolated from the outside world for weeks at a time. Communication with the outside was limited to radio contact with park headquarters and emergency services, and even that was often unreliable due to weather conditions and the mountainous terrain. The incident began during one of the worst blizzards I have ever experienced at the lake. We had been dealing with a series of winter storms that had dumped more than 8 feet of fresh snow in less than a week. The wind was howling constantly, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. We were essentially trapped in our quarters, waiting for the weather to break so we could assess the damage to park facilities. It was during the 3rd night of the storm that I first heard the sounds. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the wind rattling the windows when I became aware of something else mixed in with the storm noise. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking in urgent, hushed tones. At first I assumed it was one of my coworkers using a radio, or maybe watching something on their tablet, but when I got up to investigate, I found that everyone else was sound asleep. I returned to my bunk telling myself that I had been hearing things. The isolation and constant storm noise could play tricks on your mind, and I had experienced auditory hallucinations during previous winter assignments. But the voices continued becoming clearer and more distinct as I lay there listening. They seemed to be coming from outside the building somewhere in the storm. The next morning, when the wind finally died down enough for us to venture outside, I mentioned what I had heard to my supervisor. He listened with the kind of patient attention that suggested he had dealt with similar reports before. He explained that the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation of winter work could cause people to hear things that were not there and that it was nothing to be concerned about unless it interfered with my work performance. But I knew what I had heard, and it had not sounded like a hallucination. The voices had been too clear, too consistent, and too purposeful. They had been discussing something specific, though I could not make out the exact words. More disturbing, they had seemed to be moving around the building, as if a group of people were conducting some kind of patrol or search in the middle of a blizzard. Over the next few days, as we worked to clear snow from the visitor center and assess storm damage to park facilities, I found myself constantly listening for the voices. I did not hear them during the day, but every night they returned. Always the same pattern, starting sometime after midnight and continuing until just before dawn. Always the same urgent, hushed tones, as if people were discussing something they did not want to be overheard. The other members of our crew did not report hearing anything unusual, which made me question my own sanity. I began to wonder if the isolation was affecting me more than I had realized. I had worked winter assignments at Crater Lake for over a decade, but this was the most severe weather I had ever experienced, and we had been cut off from outside contact for longer than usual due to the repeated storms. But my doubts about what I was hearing ended abruptly during my 4th night at the lake. I was lying awake listening to the voices outside when I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of the voices clearly said my name, not shouting it, not calling out to me, but discussing me in the same hushed tone they used for everything else. "Christopher is in the East Wing. the voice said as clearly as if someone had been standing next to my bed. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone was outside our building in the middle of a blizzard, talking about me specifically. I got out of bed, pulled on my winter gear, and grabbed a powerful flashlight from my equipment kit. I was going to find out who was out there and what they wanted. The moment I stepped outside, I realized how foolish I was being. The storm was still raging, though not as violently as the previous nights. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. No rational person would be outside in these conditions unless they were in immediate danger. But I could still hear the voices coming from somewhere near the visitor center. I followed the sound, moving carefully through knee-deep snow and using my flashlight to avoid obstacles buried under the drifts. The voices seemed to be coming from the area around the main visitor center building. But as I got closer, they seemed to move away, always staying just at the edge of my hearing range. I spent nearly an hour searching through the storm, following the voices as they led me in a rough circle around the RIM facilities. My flashlight beam revealed nothing but wind-blown snow and the dark shapes of buildings and trees. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been moving through the area. But the voices continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Eventually, the cold forced me to give up the search and return to the staff quarters. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I knew I was risking frostbite by staying outside any longer. But as I reached the door to our building, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears. The voices were now coming from behind me, discussing my search in the same hushed tones they had used earlier. "He knows we are here," one voice said. "What should we do about that?" asked another. The conversation continued, but I could not make out the rest as I fumbled with the door lock and rushed inside to the warmth and safety of the building. The next morning, I told my supervisor everything that had happened during my late-night search. I expected him to be concerned about my mental state, or at least worried that I was suffering from severe cabin fever. Instead, he listened with a grim expression that suggested he knew more than he had been willing to share previously. When I finished my account, he was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape around the lake. Finally, he turned back to me and said that I was not the first maintenance worker to report hearing voices during winter assignments at Crater Lake. Over the years, several other employees had described similar experiences, always during the most severe weather, always during the deepest isolation of the winter months. He explained that the Park Service had never been able to find any explanation for the reports. There were no records of unauthorized people in the park during winter closures, and no evidence of camps or shelters that might house individuals living off the grid. The voices seemed to appear only during the worst, whether when conditions would make survival nearly impossible for anyone, caught outside without proper shelter. Some employees had theorized that the voices were related to the tragic history of Crater Lake, where numerous people had died over the years in accidents, suicides, and disappearances. The extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions might somehow amplify psychic impressions left by those who had perished at the lake. Others suggested that the voices might be connected to the Native American legends about Crater Lake being a gateway to the spirit world. But my supervisor also shared a more disturbing possibility that had been discussed among long-term park employees. There had been reports, never officially confirmed, of people living in the wilderness areas around Crater Lake during winter months. Individuals who had chosen to disconnect entirely from civilized society, surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. These hypothetical hermits would have intimate knowledge of the park layout, the location of maintenance facilities, and the schedules followed by winter crews. They might observe park employees from a distance, gathering information for reasons no one could understand. The harsh winter conditions would make detection nearly impossible, as their tracks would be quickly covered by snow and wind. The conversation with my supervisor did nothing to ease my fears about what I had been hearing. If anything, it made the situation worse by confirming that other people had experienced similar encounters. I was not losing my mind, but I was also not dealing with anything that had a rational explanation. Over the remaining weeks of my winter assignment, I continued to hear the voices on a regular basis. They seemed to be monitoring our activities, discussing our work schedules and personal habits with an attention to detail that was deeply unsettling. I began to feel like I was living under constant surveillance, watched by unseen observers who knew everything about my daily routine. The The voices followed me when I worked alone in remote areas of the park, always staying just out of sight but close enough to make their presence known. They seemed to know when I was carrying my radio and when I was beyond the range of communication with other park employees. During those times, their conversations became more detailed and more threatening. On one particularly disturbing occasion, I heard them discussing the layout of the staff quarters, including specific details about which rooms were occupied and which were empty. They knew where I slept, where I kept my personal belongings, and what my work schedule would be for the following week. The level of surveillance implied by their knowledge was terrifying. I began taking precautions that would have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances. I varied my work routes and schedules as much as possible. I never worked alone in remote areas without first checking in with other crew members. I kept emergency supplies with me at all times, including extra food, water, and cold weather gear. But the voices seemed to adapt to my precautions, always staying one step ahead of my attempts to avoid them. They began appearing in areas where I had never heard them before, including inside park buildings where they should not have been able to operate without being detected by other employees. The final incident occurred during my last week at the lake. I was conducting a routine inspection of the visitor center's heating system when I heard voices coming from somewhere inside the building. They were discussing a plan to approach me directly to make contact rather than simply observing from a distance. I immediately radioed my supervisor and requested backup, but by the time another crew member arrived, the voices had stopped. A thorough search of the building revealed no signs of intruders, no evidence that anyone had been inside who should not have been there. My supervisor arranged for me to leave the park 2 days early, officially due to a family emergency, but actually because he was concerned about my psychological state. I was relieved to go, and I have never returned to Crater Lake for a winter assignment. I still do not know what I was hearing during those weeks of isolation at the lake. The official explanation is that extreme stress and sensory deprivation caused me to experience auditory hallucinations, but I know the difference between imagination and reality, and what I heard was real. There is something in the wilderness around Crater Lake that watches and waits during the winter months, something that knows the park better than the people who work there, something that monitors human activity with an intelligence and purpose that defies explanation. Whether it is living people who have chosen to exist outside civilized society or something else entirely, I cannot say. All I know is that Crater Lake is not as empty during the winter as it appears to be. There are observers in those snow-covered forests, watchers who know your every move and discuss your activities in hushed, urgent voices that carry on the winter wind. I have transferred to a different park, one that does not require winter isolation assignments. I sleep better now, knowing that I am not being watched by unseen eyes or discussed by voices that should not exist. But sometimes on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I think I can still hear them calling my name. Most people do not know that Portland sits atop hundreds of miles of forgotten tunnels and abandoned spaces. I made it my mission to explore every single one of them until I found something down there that was exploring me back. My name is Madison, and for 3 years I have been documenting the hidden underground network that runs beneath the city. What began as a hobby became an obsession, and eventually a nightmare that I am still trying to forget. I discovered urban exploration during my second year at Portland State University. A friend mentioned the Shanghai tunnels, those infamous passages that supposedly ran beneath Old Town. Most people dismissed them as tourist folklore, but I was intrigued by the possibility that an entire hidden world existed right under our feet. I started researching the history, mapping the known entrances, and planning my first descent into the underground. The initial explorations were incredible. I found myself in forgotten basements, abandoned utility tunnels, and steam passages that had been sealed off for decades. Each discovery felt like uncovering a piece of Portland history that had been deliberately hidden from the world above. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating maps of the underground network that grew more complex with each expedition. I developed techniques for accessing the tunnel safely. I learned to pick locks, to read architectural plans, and to identify which manholes led to active infrastructure versus abandoned passages. I invested in professional equipment, including headlamps, climbing gear, and waterproof cameras. I established rules for myself. Never explore alone, always leave detailed plans with friends, and maintain emergency communication protocols. But as my explorations became more ambitious, I began to bend those safety rules. The most interesting discoveries always seemed to require solo missions into areas that other urban explorers avoided. I told myself that my experience made me capable of handling situations that would be dangerous for beginners. I was wrong about that, and my arrogance nearly cost me everything. The incident happened in early March during an exploration of a tunnel system beneath the industrial district on the east side. I had been mapping this particular network for weeks, working methodically through connected passages that seemed to extend much farther than any official records indicated. The tunnels were old, probably dating back to the early 1900s, with brick walls and arched ceilings that showed the craftsmanship of a different era. I was about 2 hours into the exploration, working my way through a section that I had never accessed before, when I noticed something unusual. The tunnels in this area showed signs of recent activity. There were fresh footprints in the dust, improvised lighting fixtures strung along the walls, and crude furniture made from salvaged materials. Someone was living down there, and they had been for quite some time. My first instinct was to turn back immediately. Encountering homeless camps in urban exploration was not uncommon, but it required extreme caution. These were people who had been pushed to the margins of society, and they often viewed explorers as threats to their safety and security. I knew the smart thing to do was to retreat and find a different route for my mapping project. But curiosity got the better of me. The living space was more elaborate than anything I had seen before. There were multiple rooms connected by carefully maintained passages, with evidence of electrical work and plumbing modifications that must have required considerable skill and planning. This was not a temporary shelter, but a permanent underground community that had somehow remained hidden from city authorities. I continued deeper into the inhabited section, moving as quietly as possible and documenting everything with my camera. The construction was impressive, with reinforced walls, drainage systems, and ventilation shafts that had been carefully integrated into the existing tunnel structure. Whoever lived here had spent years developing this space, and they clearly intended to stay. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to determine their exact location or distance. I immediately turned off my headlamp and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. The voices were male, at least 2 different speakers, and they were discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. I could not make out the specific words, but the tone was definitely threatening. They were angry about something, and that anger seemed to be directed at an intruder in their space. It took me several seconds to realize that they were talking about me. They knew I was there, and they were planning to do something about it. I started moving back toward the way I had come, but the voices seemed to be getting closer. The tunnel acoustics made it impossible to determine which direction they were approaching from, and I realized that I might have already been cut off from my planned escape route. I was in their territory, surrounded by people who viewed my presence as a direct threat to their safety and security. I found a side passage that I had not explored and decided to hide there until the voices moved away. But as I crouched in the darkness, I began to hear other sounds that made my situation much worse. There were more voices coming from different directions, and they seemed to be coordinating some kind of search pattern. They were not just looking for me. They were hunting me. The realization that I was being systematically tracked through the tunnel system triggered a panic response that I had never experienced before. My heart was racing. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely operate my equipment. I was trapped underground with an unknown number of people who clearly meant me harm, and I had no way to call for help. I forced myself to stay calm and think strategically about my situation. I had been mapping these tunnels for weeks, so I knew the general layout better than I would have in a completely unfamiliar location. There were multiple exit points, and if I could avoid the search parties, I might be able to reach one of them before being caught. But I would have to move quickly and quietly, and I could not afford to make any mistakes. I started moving through the side passages, using my knowledge of the tunnel layout to stay ahead of the voices. But the underground community clearly knew their territory much better than I did. Every time I thought I had found a clear path to an exit, I would hear voices blocking that route. They were forcing me deeper into the tunnel system, away from the exits I knew about and into areas that I had never explored. The hunt continued for what felt like hours, I moved through passage after passage, always listening for voices, always looking for a way out that was not being watched. My equipment was running low on battery power, and I knew that once my lights failed, I would be completely helpless in the darkness. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, and I began to make increasingly desperate decisions. I found myself in a section of tunnel that was partially flooded with several inches of standing water covering the floor. The water was ice cold and had a smell that suggested it was not just groundwater but sewage or industrial runoff that had been accumulating for years. I waded through it anyway, hoping that the searchers would be reluctant to follow me into such unpleasant conditions. The flooded section led to a junction with several branching passages, and for the first time in hours I could not hear any voices nearby. I chose the passage that seemed to angle upward, hoping it would lead me back toward street level and a possible exit. But after following it for several hundred yards, I found myself at a dead end with no way forward. I was forced to backtrack through the flooded section, and when I reached the junction again, I could hear voices approaching from multiple directions. They had found my trail through the water, and they were closing in on my position. I had nowhere left to run, and my battery power was nearly exhausted. In desperation, I found a drainage pipe that was just large enough for me to crawl through. It was a tight fit, and the pipe was filled with debris and standing water, but it was my only option. I turned off my headlamp to conserve what little battery power remained and began crawling through complete darkness, guided only by the feel of the pipe walls around me. The pipe seemed to go on forever. My knees and elbows were scraped raw from crawling over rough concrete and metal debris. The water soaked through my clothes, and the cold began to affect my coordination and judgment. Several times I became stuck and had to force myself through openings that seemed too small for my body, but eventually I saw light ahead of me. The pipe opened into a storm drain that led to a culvert under a busy street. I could hear traffic above me, and I knew that I was finally close to escape. I crawled the last few yards and emerged into daylight, covered in filth and shaking from cold and exhaustion. I found myself in an industrial area on the east side of the river, several miles from where I had entered the tunnel system. I was disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive and free. I walked to the nearest business and called a friend to pick me up, making up a story about a bicycle accident to explain my condition. I never returned to urban exploration after that day. The experience taught me that there are spaces beneath the city that belong to people who have been forgotten by the world above, and those people will defend their territory with whatever means they have available. I had been lucky to escape, and I knew that luck would not protect me a second time. Sometimes I still think about the underground community I discovered. I wonder who they were, how they ended up living in those tunnels, and whether they are still there. But I will never try to find out. There are some secrets that are meant to remain hidden, and some places where outsiders are not welcome. The tunnels beneath Portland are vast and complex, full of history and mystery. But they are also home to people who have nowhere else to go, and those people deserve to be left in peace. Urban exploration taught me to respect the spaces I visited, and sometimes that respect means knowing when to stay away. In 22 years of Oregon State Police work, I have dealt with everything from domestic disputes to homicides, but what I encountered on Highway 101 near Bandon defied every protocol I had ever learned. My name is Tyler, and after 2 decades in law enforcement, I thought I had seen every type of criminal behavior and emergency situation that could occur on Oregon's highways. I was wrong about that, and what happened during my patrol shift last November still keeps me awake at night. Highway 101 runs along the entire Oregon coast, connecting small towns and tourist destinations through some of the most beautiful but also most isolated stretches of road in the Pacific Northwest. During the off-season, particularly in late autumn and winter, traffic on the highway drops to almost nothing. You can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, especially on the remote sections between Bandon and Gold Beach where the road winds through dense forest and rocky coastline. I had been working the coastal patrol for 8 years, covering the stretch of Highway 101 from Coos Bay to the California border. It was generally quiet work, mostly involving traffic stops for speeding tourists and the occasional accident during storms when visibility dropped to near zero. The most serious incidents I typically dealt with were intoxicated drivers heading home from the coastal, casinos, and domestic disputes at some of the more isolated beach houses. The incident began during what should have been a routine patrol shift on a foggy November evening. I was driving southbound near Bandon around 10:30 in the evening when I received a radio call about a stranded motorist approximately 15 miles ahead of my position. The caller had used a cell phone to contact dispatch, reporting that their vehicle had broken down and that they were parked on the shoulder of the highway waiting for assistance. This type of call was common along Highway 101, especially during the rainy season when older vehicles frequently experienced mechanical problems. My standard procedure was to respond to the location, assess the situation, and either provide assistance or coordinate with a tow truck company to get the stranded vehicle off the highway. As I drove toward the reported location, I noticed that the fog was becoming increasingly dense, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some areas. This was also typical for the Oregon coast. During autumn and winter, when warm ocean air collided with cooler land, temperatures to create thick marine layers that could persist for hours. When I reached the coordinates provided by dispatch, I found no sign of a stranded vehicle or motorist. I parked my patrol car on the shoulder and activated my emergency lights, then began searching the immediate area for any evidence that someone had been there recently. I checked both sides of the highway, looked for tire tracks in the soft shoulder, and used my flashlight to examine the ditch areas where a vehicle might have gone off the road. After 20 minutes of searching, I radioed dispatch to report that I had found no trace of the reported stranded motorist. The dispatcher confirmed the coordinates and suggested that the caller might have been confused about their exact location, which was also common in areas where cell phone coverage was spotty and GPS signals could be unreliable. I was preparing to expand my search to adjacent areas when I noticed headlights approaching from the north. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was moving unusually slowly, barely maintaining highway speed, despite the fact that this particular section of road was straight and relatively safe. Even in foggy conditions, the vehicle passed my position without stopping, which struck me as odd since most drivers would at least slow down or pull over when they saw a patrol car with emergency lights activated. As the taillights disappeared into the fog ahead of me, I decided to follow and conduct a routine traffic stop to see if the driver was experiencing problems or needed assistance. I caught up with the vehicle after about 2 miles, but when I activated my overhead lights to signal the driver to pull over, the car did not respond. It continued traveling at the same slow speed, maintaining its position in the right lane without acknowledging my presence. I radioed in my position and license plate number, but dispatch reported that the plate did not match any vehicle in their database. Over the next several miles, I followed the vehicle while repeatedly activating my siren and using my public address system to instruct the driver to pull over. The car showed no response to any of my attempts to make contact, continuing to travel at exactly 35 mph, despite the posted speed limit of 55 mph. As we continued south, I began to notice other unusual aspects of the situation. The vehicle itself appeared to be an older model sedan, possibly from the 1980s or early 1990s, but it was in remarkably good condition despite its apparent age. The taillights were bright and clear. The body showed no signs of rust or damage, and the exhaust was clean without any visible smoke or emissions. More disturbing, I could not see any occupants inside the vehicle despite being directly behind it with my headlights providing illumination through the rear window. The car appeared to be driving itself, maintaining perfect lane control and consistent speed without any visible human intervention. After following the vehicle for nearly 10 miles, I made the decision to attempt a PIT maneuver to force it to stop. This was an extreme measure, but I was growing increasingly concerned about the safety implications of a vehicle that was not responding to law enforcement signals and appeared to be operating without a driver. I positioned my patrol car alongside the rear quarter panel of the suspect vehicle and began to execute the maneuver. But at the moment of contact, something impossible happened. My patrol car passed directly through the other vehicle as if it were not there at all. I felt no impact, heard no sound of collision, and experienced no change in my vehicle's momentum or direction. I immediately pulled over to the side of the highway, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just occurred. I sat in my patrol car for several minutes, checking my equipment and trying to determine if I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency or equipment malfunction that might explain what I had witnessed. I radioed dispatch to request backup and medical assistance, explaining that I was experiencing a situation that I could not adequately describe or understand. The dispatcher asked if I was injured or in immediate danger, and I honestly did not know how to answer. I was physically unharmed, but I was deeply shaken by an encounter that violated every law of physics and reality that I understood. While I waited for backup to arrive, I conducted a thorough inspection of my patrol car, looking for any sign of damage that might indicate I had actually collided with another vehicle. I found no evidence of impact, no scratches or dents, and no debris that might have come from another car. According to all physical evidence, I had not made contact with anything during my attempted PIT maneuver. When backup arrived 30 minutes later, I explained the situation to Sergeant Rodriguez, a 25-year veteran of the state police who had worked the coastal patrol longer than anyone in our unit. He listened to my account with a serious expression, asking detailed questions about the vehicle's appearance, behavior, and my attempts to make contact. When I finished my report, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes before telling me something that changed my understanding of the entire incident. He explained that I was not the first officer to report encounters with phantom vehicles on Highway 101, particularly in the area between Bandon and Gold Beach where my incident had occurred. Over the years, several other officers had described similar experiences involving vehicles that appeared normal at first glance, but exhibited impossible behavior when subjected to closer examination. These vehicles never responded to traffic stops, never pulled over despite extended pursuit, and sometimes seemed to vanish entirely when officers attempted to make physical contact. Rodriguez told me that the department had an unofficial policy of not discussing these incidents publicly, partly to avoid ridicule and partly because there was no rational explanation for what officers were witnessing. The reports were filed and documented, but no further investigation was conducted because there was no evidence of criminal activity and no apparent threat to public safety. He also shared some historical context that made the situation even more unsettling. The stretch of Highway 101 where these incidents occurred had been the site of numerous fatal accidents over the decades, including several cases where drivers had simply disappeared along with their vehicles. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of the missing drivers or cars, despite extensive efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. Some of the missing person cases dated back to the 1960s and 1970s, when Highway 101 was even more isolated and dangerous than it is today. Families had reported that their loved ones had failed to arrive at their destinations after traveling this route, but no evidence was ever found to indicate what had happened to them. Rodriguez suggested that what I had encountered might be connected to these historical disappearances. Though he admitted that he had no explanation for how such a connection might be possible, he recommended that I file a complete report of the incident, but advised me not to discuss it with other officers or civilians who might not understand the unique challenges of coastal patrol work. I followed his advice and filed a detailed report. But I also began conducting my own research into the history of Highway 101 and the missing person cases that Rodriguez had mentioned. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original incident. Over the past 50 years, at least 17 people had disappeared while traveling the section of Highway 101 between Bandon and Gold Beach. Their vehicles had never been found despite extensive searches of the coastline, forest areas, and remote roads in the region. In several cases, witnesses had reported seeing the missing person's vehicle on the highway after they were supposed to have reached their destination. But these sightings were generally dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. Reading through these historical accounts, I began to wonder if what I had encountered was not a phantom vehicle, but rather evidence of some ongoing phenomenon that had been claiming travelers on this stretch of highway for decades. Perhaps the people who disappeared were still somehow present on the road, continuing their journeys in a form that was visible but not quite real. I requested a transfer to a different patrol area 6 months after the incident. I told my supervisors that I wanted new challenges and opportunities for professional development. But the truth was that I could no longer patrol Highway 101 without thinking about what I had encountered that foggy November night. I still drive the coastal highway occasionally when visiting family or taking vacation trips, but I am always aware of the other vehicles around me in ways I never was before. Sometimes late at night when the fog is thick and visibility is poor, I think I see familiar taillights in my mirrors, always maintaining that same impossibly consistent speed and distance. I know that some of my fellow officers think I experienced a hallucination or some kind of stress-related episode, but I also know what I saw. And I know that Highway 101 holds secrets that go far beyond anything covered in police training or protocol manuals. The Oregon coast is beautiful, but it is also dangerous, and some of that danger cannot be addressed by conventional law enforcement methods. All I can do is continue serving and protecting to the best of my ability, while remaining aware that there are forces at work on these remote highways that I will never fully understand. I have been part of Mount Hood's search and rescue team for 6 years, and we have saved dozens of lives in those mountains. But our last mission in the wilderness area near Government Camp was not about saving anyone. It was about surviving what we found up there. My name is Brandon, and what happened during our February 2024 rescue operation changed my understanding of what exists in the high country around Oregon's most dangerous peak. Mount Hood is one of the most climbed mountains in North America, attracting thousands of hikers and climbers every year. It is also one of the most deadly, with an average of 3 to 4 fatalities annually and dozens of rescue operations. Our team, Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue, responds to calls from county sheriffs when people go missing or get injured in the backcountry areas around the mountain. The mission began with a standard distress call on February 15th. A group of 3 experienced backcountry skiers had failed to return from a planned 2-day trip into the Government Camp wilderness area. Their emergency locator beacon had activated around 4:30 p.m., indicating they were in serious trouble somewhere in the vast expanse of forest and alpine terrain on the mountain's southwest slopes. Weather conditions were challenging but not impossible. Fresh snow had fallen during the previous 48 hours, and temperatures were well below freezing. But visibility was good and winds were relatively calm. We assembled a team of 8 volunteers, including myself as team leader, and began organizing our search strategy based on the beacon's last known coordinates. The missing skiers were all local residents with extensive backcountry experience. Tom Bradley, 34, was a certified ski instructor who had been exploring Mount Hood's wilderness areas for over 10 years. Sarah Chen, 29, was an emergency room nurse who regularly participated in avalanche rescue training. Mark Stevens, 41, was a professional mountain guide who had summited Mount Hood more than 20 times. These were not inexperienced tourists who had gotten in over their heads. They were skilled outdoors enthusiasts who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. The fact that their emergency beacon had been activated suggested they were dealing with something serious, possibly a severe injury or avalanche burial that prevented them from self-rescuing. We began our search at first light on February 16th, using snowmobiles to access the general area where the beacon signal had originated. The terrain in that section of Mount Hood is extremely challenging, with steep slopes, deep ravines, and dense forest that can hide hazards like tree wells and unstable snow conditions. The initial phase of our search followed standard protocols. We divided into 2 teams and began working systematic search patterns using avalanche probes and rescue dogs to check areas where the missing skiers might be buried under snow. We also used GPS units to precisely navigate to the coordinates provided by their emergency beacon. After 4 hours of intensive searching, we found their camp. The 3 skiers had established a well-organized base camp in a sheltered area near a grove of large pine trees. Their tents were properly set up, their equipment was neatly arranged, and there were no signs of avalanche activity or other natural disasters that might explain their disappearance. But the camp had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Food was still cooking on their camp stove. Personal belongings were scattered around the site, and their sleeping bags were thrown aside, as if they had been sleeping when something forced them to leave immediately. Most disturbing, we found clear evidence that they had left the camp during the night in sub-zero temperatures, in dangerous conditions that no experienced backcountry traveler would willingly venture into. We followed their tracks leading away from the camp and immediately realized that something was very wrong. The tracks showed that all 3 skiers had been moving together in a tight group, but they were not following any logical route towards safety. Instead, they appeared to be heading deeper into the wilderness toward terrain that was more dangerous and further from any possible rescue or shelter. The tracks also showed signs that the skiers had been moving unusually fast, almost running on their skis despite poor visibility and hazardous conditions. There were several places where 1 or more of them had fallen, but they had gotten up immediately and continued moving in the same direction. as if they were fleeing from something behind them. After following the trail for nearly 2 miles, we came to an area where the tracks suddenly stopped. Not gradually as if the skiers had removed their skis to continue on foot, but abruptly in the middle of an open slope, where there was no logical reason for them to change direction or method of travel. The snow around the end of the ski tracks was disturbed in ways that we could not explain. There were marks and impressions that did not match any equipment the skiers had been carrying, and the snow itself seemed to have been compressed by something much heavier than 3 people on skis. We spent the rest of that day expanding our search in all directions from where the tracks ended, but we found no further sign of the missing skiers. We used avalanche probes to check for possible burial sites, thermal imaging equipment to look for body heat signatures, and trained search dogs to try to pick up human scent traces. As evening approached, we established our own camp near the location where the ski tracks had ended. Standard protocol for multi-day search operations required us to maintain a base camp that could serve as a command post and staging area for continued searching. We set up our tents, prepared hot meals, and organized watch schedules for the night. It was during the first watch around 11:30 p.m. that we encountered the phenomenon that transformed our rescue mission into something entirely different. I was on duty with Jake Morrison, a veteran rescue volunteer with over 15 years of mountain experience, when we first heard the sounds. They started as distant voices barely audible over the wind through the pine trees. At first we assumed they were coming from other members of our team, perhaps talking quietly in their tents. But when we checked, we found that everyone else was asleep and the voices were coming from somewhere outside our camp. The voices sounded like people calling for help, which would have been consistent with finding the missing skiers. But there was something wrong with the calls. They seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and they had an echoing quality that did not match the acoustics of the area where we were camped. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and emergency medical supplies and began moving toward the source of the voices, following standard procedures for responding to calls for help in the wilderness. But as we got closer to where the sounds seemed to be coming from, they would move, always staying just at the edge of our hearing range. We spent nearly an hour following the voices through the forest, but we never found anyone who might have been calling for help. The sounds led us in a rough circle around our camp, always seeming to come from just ahead of us but never getting closer or more distinct. When we returned to camp, we discovered that our tents had been moved, not dramatically and not in a way that suggested deliberate vandalism, but they were definitely in different positions than where we had set them up earlier in the evening. Our equipment had also been rearranged, with items moved from their original locations and placed in neat piles that none of our team members remembered creating. The other members of our search team had been awakened by the disturbance, and they had their own reports of unusual activity. Several people described feeling as if they were being watched while trying to sleep, and 2 team members reported seeing figures moving between the trees just outside the circle of light cast by our camp lanterns. We conducted a thorough perimeter check, looking for any evidence of who might have been in our camp while Jake and I were following the voices. We found footprints in the snow around our tents, but they were not from any of our team members. The prints appeared to be from bare feet, which made no sense given the sub-zero temperatures and deep snow conditions. At that point, we made the decision to terminate the search operation and evacuate our team from the mountain. As experienced rescue volunteers, we were trained to recognize when conditions had become too dangerous to continue, and the unexplained activity around our camp clearly represented a threat to our safety. But our evacuation was complicated by equipment failures that had not been present earlier in the mission. Our GPS units began providing inconsistent readings, making it difficult to navigate back to our vehicles. Our radio communications with base camp became intermittent and filled with static. Even our emergency backup equipment seemed to be affected by whatever was causing the other malfunctions. The return trip to our staging area took nearly twice as long as expected, as we were forced to rely on compass navigation and visual landmarks to find our way through terrain that several of our team members had traveled many times before. Throughout the descent, we continued to hear the voices calling from various locations around us, but we made no attempt to investigate or respond. When we finally reached our vehicles and re-established communication with county emergency services, we learned that the search for the 3 missing skiers had been called off. Their bodies had been found early that morning by a different search team, working in an area more than 5 miles from where we had been searching. The circumstances of their deaths raised questions that were never adequately answered. All 3 bodies were found together in a location that made no logical sense given the evidence we had found at their camp and along their ski trail. They appeared to have died from exposure, but they were discovered without any of their survival equipment, including the heavy winter clothing they had been wearing when they left their camp. Most disturbing, the location where their bodies were found was accessible only by traveling through terrain that would have been extremely difficult and dangerous to navigate at night, especially without proper equipment. There was no explanation for how or why they had made such a journey, or what had happened to their skis, packs, and other gear. The official incident report concluded that the 3 skiers had become disoriented during the night and had made poor decisions that led to their deaths from exposure. But those of us who had been involved in the search knew that the explanation did not account for the evidence we had observed or the unusual phenomena we had encountered. I submitted a detailed report describing everything our team had experienced during the search operation, but I was advised by county officials that such details would not be helpful to the families of the deceased and might create unnecessary public concern about safety in the Mount Hood Wilderness area. I have not participated in any search and rescue operations on Mount Hood since that mission. I transferred to a team that works primarily in lower elevation areas, telling my supervisors that I wanted to focus on urban rescue operations. But the truth is that I can no longer feel comfortable in the high country around Mount Hood, knowing that there are things up there that do not have rational explanations. The mountain continues to attract thousands of climbers and hikers every year, and search and rescue teams continue to respond when people get into trouble in the wilderness areas. But I know that some of the dangers they face cannot be addressed by training, equipment, or experience, and that Mount Hood holds secrets that go far beyond the well-documented risks of avalanches, weather, and difficult terrain. Sometimes the people who go missing in those mountains encounter something other than natural hazards, and sometimes the rescue team sent to find them discovers that they are not alone in the wilderness after all.